Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Ariel Property Advisors, Sterling National Bank, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group. Additional support has been provided by grants from AVR Realty Company, Amarant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, B6 Real Estate Advisors, Briarwood Organization, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chase Commercial Mortgage, Citizens Bank, CPEX Real Estate Services, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handler Properties LLC, Handler Real Estate, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Matone Group, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, SJP Properties, Stonehenge NYC, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Merengoff Family Foundation, and these friends. It's the best borough in the city of New York. It's a place to live, work, shop, visit. It's Brooklyn. So today, with the help of my executive producer and dear friend Tim King, we're doing a show on Brooklyn. As I said, my guests include Tim King, who's the managing partner at SVN CPEX, Steve Kassin, managing partner, managing director at Infinity Real Estate Group, and last but not least, Greg Blake, who is the director at Meadow Partners. So Steve and I are Brooklyn born and bred. Where'd you grow up?
Long Island.
Since I know the principles of Meadow, how did you get involved into?
We've always, even within Manhattan, I guess originally, we've always been focused on pioneering markets and where we can see some underlying trends that will result in gentrification and good rental growth. And we like to be there first. So we were one of the first institutional investors in Greenpoint. We bought 110 Green Street, which was a distressed sale at the time, and then was when we sold it, the first $100 million sale in Greenpoint. And then we moved to South Williamsburg, and we saw a lot of parallels between that and the East Village and Lower East Side.
You went to Greenpoint before Williamsburg, even though in many cases Williamsburg was first before Greenpoint.
Well, Williamsburg had evolved, and so we saw and we were already in Long Island City, so it was a natural progression between the two neighborhoods of, this is a cheaper value alternative to renters that want to live in Williamsburg, but pay a price that's probably closer to Long Island City at the time. And so that was one of our first investments over there, and that's always been a theme for us, is relative value to what you can get either in Manhattan or now, probably more specifically, within different neighborhoods of Brooklyn.
Steve, in your real estate career, not your life because you grew up in Brooklyn, where was your first investment and what are you doing today in Brooklyn?
Sure. So our first investment in Brooklyn was a 6-pack of small properties that we bought from a historic owner that was coming of age and wanted to complete some estate planning.
Residential or retail?
It was a mixed bag. It was single tenant dollar stores, a couple of small buildings with a few units above retail. And what's really rewarding is that package of buildings resulted in some of the greatest small developments we've done in parts of Brooklyn that were mostly ignored during the first phase of Brooklyn's renaissance. So we have the good fortune of being able to redevelop these properties now and do it with a very, very safe basis, and with the advantage of seasoning and time on our side. We could choose the right use groups to incorporate into the buildings and find the right tenants to place into the buildings either before or during construction.
Let's talk in specifics about Kingswood, because I've had Alan Rose on my show over the years. So you took a property that Alan, as I would say, nurtured it as a young businessman, and he took it to a certain level, and you took it to the next level. Let's talk about that, and then the addition with Targets and Marshall.
Sure. So the Kingswood package is made up of two buildings, Kingswood 1 and Kingswood 2. The Rose Group did a great job with Kingswood 1, basically leased the entire project up with a combination of retail and office use and some medical administration as well. So in there you have TJ Maxx, New York Sports Club, and then a bunch of institutional tenants that make up a few 100,000 square foot building that includes a multi-deck parking lot. Down the block, there was another Muni lot that was part of Allen's original development deal with the city, and we were fortunate enough to pre-lease all of the retail, about 60,000 feet of retail in that building ahead of construction, and we were able to optimize what we ultimately built, which is a 5-story Class A, kind of groundbreaking type development for the area, in that I don't think office space of this quality and magnitude has been delivered in our neighborhood to date. And really the uniqueness is the size of the floor plates. To put it into context, our Kingswood 2 development that I just referenced has 12 partners surrounding our site, 12 neighbors surrounding our site. So how does that contextualize it? In that the average lot on Kings Highway or adjacent to this property is no wider than 15 or 20 feet, which means when we came to market with a 20,000 foot floor plate, we had 4 or 5 times the retail demand from junior and big box users than we did the
Right,
space
because
to offer
Kings
them.
Highway was basically, it was local retailers, small locations, which has always done well, but there was a need for the communities. So as opposed to people saying that retail is dead, retail is not brick and mortar, retail is not dead.
It's not. Brooklyn's just becoming more walkable, and it's converting from a place where people in South Brooklyn, especially where we focus, would normally drive 15 or 20 minutes to destination retail places that, to buy their necessities. They're now realizing that, driving, parking, and going the distance
And you
is no
also
longer
took care
necessary.
of the urban target, as opposed to
Correct.
110,000 square foot or 130,000 target, you went to the 35,000.
That's right, and they were a great partner.
Where do you see the opportunities, Tim? Do you see it on the waterfront in Brooklyn?
I see it everywhere. And just to go back for a second to Steve's project, I worked with the AVR before they built it and put the visiting nurse service to Greater New York into a big chunk of office space there. So opportunities everywhere. It's a function of being able to exploit the local conditions. It's getting harder and harder to find what Steve was just talking about, which is a project with any sort of scale. Another feature that he has that's remarkable for that part of the world is parking.
But that's a question, and I was going to bring it out to both Greg and to Steve. Today, in the world with Ubers, Lyfts, Via, and all the rest, and the fact that people aren't using their cars that much, do you think you really need that much parking for developments? I know some of you are restricted because of what you build, that they have requirements that you need X number of spaces per apartments.
I mean, it's very site specific. I think in some of the neighborhoods that you were mentioning, it's definitely more important. As you get more to the urban infill of a downtown Brooklyn.
Right. I don't see the parking need in downtown Brooklyn today.
No.
Okay, because you have great transportation by the subways.
I think the advent of Uber, Revel, the scooter company, and is all very helpful, and it's only expanded neighborhoods. But the issue is that a lot of these further out east Brooklyn neighborhoods, you still rely on a car. I mean, whether it's to just get to other areas, whether it's because you have kids and it's not easy to put kids in Ubers and or on an electric scooter.
You bring up a very interesting. I've done a number of shows on New Rochelle and Yonkers, and I would say to these developers, because they would say, it's a low-cost advantage. We're saving $20 to $30 a square foot in rent, but then they'd say, but you need a car. I said, you're talking that you're a transit-oriented development next to a train. They said, fine, but that's getting to work. What do I do on the weekend? So it relates to exactly to your point.
Yeah, parking is still important, in depending on your area.
Yes, and I think our area of Brooklyn
calls for it.
It does call for it. Mass transit is pretty good. I think the introduction of ride sharing, Uber, will kind of shift the paradigm, and I think that the traffic troubles and the parking troubles in South Brooklyn are also starting to reculture and re-engineer the makeup of communities. We moved from Manhattan to Brooklyn within the past year. My wife and I either walk or Uber everywhere. And I think it's because we've been programmed to raise a family in Manhattan. People that have had the opposite experience, where they've always kind of existed and grown a family in Brooklyn, they're not cultured in that way yet, but I think it's happening.
Here's a question. Many times major companies didn't go to Brooklyn for their main headquarters for office space. They'd go there for back office, like Chase went over there, and so on. Do you see more companies going there and making a decision, to go to Dumbo or go to the Navy Yard or go to the Gowanus or go to the Industry City today for office space?
So I think that has not yet happened. To your point, most of the office space is still the service, back office, accounting type functions. But I think what you're going to see is that some CEO who lives in Dumbo is going to decide that, we could take 400,000 feet here. There used to be a big price differential between most of Manhattan and Brooklyn, where Brooklyn was the less expensive alternative, and that's why you put the back office operations there. As that delta has shifted, as those numbers get closer together, it's now going to become, where do you get that first trophy tenant? Where do you get someone who becomes the pioneer and takes 250,000 or 500,000 square feet? And I think this year, or by this time next year, that will happen. And once it does, and there's sort of like this imprimatur on Brooklyn as a primary office space, you'll see more and more firms making that transition.
Yeah, I think Dumbo's been the first step in that. Etsy and Rent the Runway are real companies that moved to Dumbo.
But if you look, it did take many.
It took a long time.
Dumbo started in the mid '80s with David Willentis.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was a different time and a different market. Today, more people are working from their homes. There's the co-working situation and so on. Now, you have a building at 89 Willoughby, right?
57 Willoughby.
57 Willoughby. What are the type of tenants you have over there?
Right now, it's still legacy tenants. So it's Housing Works, which is a nonprofit, and the Brooklyn School of Autism, which is also a nonprofit school. Helen Keller actually owned the building previously and occupied the remaining space in the building, which they just moved down the street to Livingston, and now we're redeveloping it. But the types of tenants that we're targeting are, we've always taken a relative value approach. So whereas there's the new ground up projects that are trying to set the high water marks in some of these rents that we're talking about and trying to attract the major tenant from Manhattan, we've been trying to play off of the existing tenancy. Not that we wouldn't welcome a tenant from Manhattan to move over.
The real key for the benefit of a tenant coming from Manhattan to Brooklyn is that they would be able to capture the REIT benefits, which is like $12 a foot. Mm-hmm. So that's a big opportunity over there for that person. But if to have that tenant who's growing in Brooklyn, you'd have no problem. It's just a question of the economics.
Yeah, and I think Tim can probably attest to this. There's still significant demand for the courthouses, for regular businesses. Tammy is a very sexy tenancy term, but there are law firms, there are architects, there's design firms that are all looking at the space, and there's actually not much availability in downtown Brooklyn, aside from some of the new developments that are still being built.
I think the growth in Brooklyn office is going to be more organic rather than Manhattan-centric larger firms making a move in mass, only because the talent pull of New York City coming in through Grand Central, the ferries, the path.
If you look at Grand Central with both the Long Island Railroad and the Amtrak, you're going to have, it's really going to be a key. And many people on my shows have said the best opportunities in Manhattan are in the Grand Central neighborhood.
It's a double. You're asking people to do a double commute in most cases to move to Brooklyn. I have an office of a relatively small organization of 25 people in Manhattan, and we've contemplated a move to Brooklyn. And we did a travel study for all of the key employees, and it was a pretty significant bump on both an actual time and a percentage basis to ask people to land in Manhattan from New Jersey, Connecticut, Westchester, wherever they come, and then to go from there to Brooklyn. And I think that's the major challenge. Now, the bright side of things is Brooklyn itself as a corporate center, medical center, retail center in New York City has a lot more population than it does build out of all of these uses. So the good news is I think that these new neighborhoods, these new business centers, medical centers that are popping up in Brooklyn are a result of a lot of pent-up demand and people that are tired of the expense and inconvenience of traveling to downtown Brooklyn or even to Manhattan for these services.
I know that you were responsible a couple of years ago for Bed Bath & Beyond, who went downtown. How are the stores doing over there?
So it's about Bar and Shine in Sunset Park?
Right.
So they're doing very, very well. In fact, I had some executives from Bed Bath in the car a couple of weeks ago talking about the shifting demographics, how you could literally go up 30th Street from 3rd Avenue to 5th Avenue and see one part of the world where you might almost think that you were perhaps in Mexico City or something. Go a few blocks further north to 8th Avenue and you're in Hong Kong, and a few blocks up and you're in Jerusalem on 13th Avenue. And these guys were kind of blown away with what a crock pot, never mind, a melting pot of humanity was there. So they're doing fine. They, again, like Stephen mentioned earlier, his tenants exceeding expectations. Those stores are knocking it out of the park. And I know that next door to Industry City, they're trying to get the ULURP started to bring in more retail there as well. And that goes back to the earlier point of the scale, because there's only those sorts of places where you can still be able to accommodate a 100 or 200,000 square foot tenant. It's getting harder and harder to do elsewhere.
How do you compare the residential in downtown Brooklyn to the residential in Long Island City?
They actually are fairly similar. They're totally different, but the renter has a similar demographic. And I think in both...
Because they're both relatively close to the city to come into to work.
Yeah, different areas,
Right.
Downtown versus midtown, and they're both offering very highly amenitized buildings, something that is frankly not really offered anymore in Manhattan. You're either in a walk-up or it's a luxury condo building. There's not much of an in-between if you want to live in Manhattan. And so you're seeing a lot of people migrate to these areas, especially as they mature now and have the retail and, slowly are getting offices over there as well. From having properties in both areas,
That's why I brought up the
you
question.
often see on the leasing report that this person is looking in both Long Island City and downtown Brooklyn.
On the retail aspect, how do you look at downtown Brooklyn to, let's say, the Brooklyn College neighborhood where the Triangle Shopping Center is?
Yep, the Junction.
The Junction.
I think it's a story of different maturation. Downtown Brooklyn is fully urbanized. A lot of great independent concepts and chain-owned concepts have already come. They're tested. And I think it's been attracted by all the residential and commercial development that's gone on through the last two cycles. Whereas near Brooklyn College, really southern Brooklyn, there's still a lot of hesitation. You can take retailers, entertainment businesses, food and beverage businesses on tours, show them multi-million-dollar homes, show them multiple communities of different cultures that are embedded, that are invested in these parts of Brooklyn, and that have highly inconvenient access to retail, to food and beverage, and to entertainment. And many of them still won't be the first mover at a $30 rent, a $40 rent, a $50 rent. whereas their profit models would all work with those rent levels. So we've been a little bit frustrated, admittingly. We think that the story is a lot more exciting in parts of Brooklyn that aren't yet built out from a retail and F&B standpoint. And we feel like things are starting to happen, albeit slowly, and that early movers will be rewarded and have been rewarded.
What about the Gowanus? Timmy, anyone?
So again, the Gowanus is one of those areas where the pioneers are now have essentially established the validity, the need, and you're starting to see more mainstream tenants come in. And I think that that's an area where the retail rents are going to continue to just skyrocket over time.
What about Red Hook? You had the IKEA, you had the Fairway. The transportation is really poor.
So both of those stores you mentioned are very much the ultimate destination type tenant. I don't know that you'll see Red Hook develop into the same sort of retail concentration as you would in Sunset Park, the Gowanus, or downtown.
Did anyone ever realize that the retail was going to do so well in Williamsburg, I think?
It's outperformed. I mean, the original Edge development on the waterfront created a pedestrian foot traffic that was not, I think, anticipated originally to the L train. And I think you're going to see a similar dynamic take place in South Williamsburg with the development, the Domino Sugar development. From there and along South 4th, South 5th, South 3rd Street to the JMZ, you're going to get similar foot traffic because of the sheer density of these developments.
Now, when we're talking about Brooklyn, which is large, we've omitted talking about Coney Island and East New York. Any thoughts about that? I mean, because near East New York, you have that related shopping center over there, which I believe is doing relatively well, but it's a destination. Mm-hmm. Okay, what about those markets? I mean, because you can buy land at a lower price, you can be a pioneer a little bit.
I think you'll see fairly significant industrial development around East New York. It's located close enough to JFK, and there's a lot more demand now for last mile distribution, serving some of these more dense neighborhoods. I still think it's pretty far away from any sort of real gentrification. Coney Island is a little bit of a different animal. It's self-sufficient. It's had a lot of long-term owners, but they're certainly unique from the rest of the Brooklyn areas we've been discussing.
I haven't focused much in East New York. We've looked at some one-off properties in Coney Island, and it could be a product of when we looked at these opportunities, just in the context of the cycle, but for us, the opportunity just wasn't compelling enough to enter in the neighborhood.
There's the question of you have the BJs and you have the Costco's who have done well in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. Do you think Brooklyn could take another big box store like a BJ's or a Supercenter?
I think the answer is yes, and I think the retailers know it, but they struggle to find sites. If you look at some of the discounters and where they opened up in parts of Brooklyn that most of us wouldn't have considered developing in 5, 7, or 10 years ago, and the revenue numbers that they're doing on strange, almost not non-retail streets.
I think no one ever expected like the Alamo Draft House was going to do that well in the movie theater. So they're...
I think one of the smartest merchants to enter Brooklyn in a pioneering way and do really well with it is TJX Companies. They've put stores in really, creative locations and boxes, and they've been rewarded, I think, every time. And I think that that's part of the evolution of retail. It's not only getting digitized, onto our computer screens or our tablets or our phones. I think the consumer is becoming a little bit lazier in what they're willing to do to have a shopping experience. So if you're not a destination in that you have a cult following for your brand, or there's a certain demographic that seeks your experience, I think people want ease of access. They want it to be as immediately rewarding and convenient to buy something down the block versus ordering it on Amazon and having it 24 hours later.
As I said to you guys, I did a panel last week for this group, and we were talking about what the File organization did with basically e-commerce spots on 51st Street and made it bricks and mortar in Ticino, Untucket, Jack Warren. So, I said to them, the only thing is you had Purdy over there, otherwise you would have had Warby Parker.
Yep.
There's been a lot of industrial properties which have been converted to office, which are not doing that well in general. Any thoughts about that?
I think there was a point in time, we're following the residential boom, that people started to look for what's the next thing. And frankly, commercial properties were cheaper, and they thought they could draft off of Manhattan or maybe a lease here or there in a popular neighborhood. Right. But one of the biggest problems we found is in a lot of those neighborhoods, the entire zoning is commercial. There's no barriers to entry. Every single property could be turned into a high-end, cool office building. But the reality is there's not demand for that. And that's been the biggest issue for a lot of these.
And the issue is last mile distribution, rental rates and operating metrics still don't justify the inflation that's happened in having to buy and activate real estate in some of these areas. So the idea of preserving or converting back to even very progressive industrial space is still a challenge.
So I think my crystal apples who are here are very bright for Brooklyn. Only positive things are going to happen, and I think there's going to be development. And I'm happy that Tim, my executive producer, brought you over here. Once again, I'd like to thank Steve and Greg, and I'll see you next week.